So let's start off looking at some of the evolutionary dynamics that we need to understand in order to possibly make sense of status, competition, and leadership. If we go back to evolutionary psychology, the classical view, we need to think about what was life like back in our environment of ancestral adaptedness. So what were the kind of issues that our ancestors had to solve in order to survive and pass on their genes? Two key problems, according to modern evolutionary psychologists, are first of all to negotiate status dynamics. So who should lead us? Who should be in charge of the group? Who do we trust us to protect and lead us through the environment and um, look out for the best of our group? And the second one is how do we distribute scarce resources? So who should get what? How do we detect who is a cheater or a free rider, and what should we do with those people? And those were adaptive problems that our ancestors had to solve, and you will probably also immediately recognize that these are central problems to modern politics. We obviously select leaders these days, but a lot of the problems that we debate in parliament and beyond parliament have to do with how to distribute resources and how to deal with people who do not follow our system. You might have specific opinions on these questions here, and they are pretty much all centrally related to one or the other adaptive problem. Yet they tend to be much more complex, involving many more individuals, many more groups, technological issues. And so the argument that evolutionary psychologists like Michael Bank-Peterson and Lene Aureux have put forward is that there is some kind of mismatch between how we would have solved these kind of problems in the past and how we tend to solve them through democratic institutions today. They look at historical trends. So for example, they look at the timing of the transition to agriculture and how many, you know, countries in the modern world transitioned to agriculture. And what we can see here is only a few nations have about 10,000 year history of agriculture. Most of the modal distribution shows that most countries transition to agriculture, to a settled form of living around, like in the period between 2 and 4,000 years ago. This is something that we had covered already in the human evolution sections. But the interesting question now is state society. So settling in specific locations and starting to shift to agriculture is one thing, but then developing large-scale institutions that govern all social relationships is rather a different issue. And as you can see, most societies, modern day societies, shifted to state society setups and institutions very recently. So in the last 500 years. And now if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, this is a time period that is way too short for us to to adapt to these demands and come up with genetically through natural selection, come up with possible solutions in order to solve these problems. So this is where the mismatch idea that is central to many evolutionary psychology hypotheses comes in. In our ancestral environment, we often solved problems through face-to-face interactions. So on the left hand side here, We might have had a village council where individuals come together, debate issues, and conflicts, if they were, like not being, if you could not solve these conflicts directly there, then often what we had were violent encounters, skirmishes, raids, um, warfare at a limited level in order to solve these problems. So we had rather hostile, aggressive past in some way. And as we had discussed last week, to some extent, this aggression, in particular between males in their competition for status, could have been adaptive in our evolutionary past. So now, what is happening in modern environments? We have very different contextual situations. So we have similar social problems, but now they are set in much more complex social situations. So they're exceptionally more complex. And we have no adaptive psychological systems in our brain. So coming back to the evolutionary psychology idea that we have domain specificity in our, or domain specific um, mechanisms that have evolved over our evolutionary history in our brain that could help us dealing with these exceptionally complex problems. Cues that we might have relied on in our evolutionary past in these village council meetings were based on face-to-face interactions. Obviously, in a modern day mass democratic society, we don't have a chance to interact face to face with individuals. And even though we train, for example, our young people in democratic um, ways through all sorts of parliamentary simulations, elections to all sorts of student bodies, once we get into the larger politics, it becomes very impersonal. So we are lacking the intimate social information that our brain would need in order to decide who can we trust in order to lead us. And another issue is when we look at parliament and how decisions are being made or discussed, what we're typically trying to do is we try to come up with rules in our modern environment that are abstract in general, that apply across all sorts of special cases. We create laws in order to apply them generically to all sorts of specific cases. Yet our ancestral logic, according to evolutionary psychologists, deals with these problems in a highly specific way. So our ancestral logic is based on coalitions and in-groups, out-groups, which requires a very different way of solving these problems that do not trigger us to think about it in general abstract rule mechanisms. So this is, like these are some of the kind of core differences that evolutionary psychologists have argued create problems for our ancestral brain in modern environments. And so this is kind of a preliminary summary of the generic perspective on these political issues that we're dealing with, namely that we solved adaptive problems in our environment of evolutionary adaptedness in a slightly different way. So issues around social competition and resource distribution were solved in different ways in typically face-to-face direct interactions where people could rely on high quality cues, whether people could be trusted, and then rules were applied to specific cases and specific individuals rather than us trying to come up with generic abstract rules that would apply across all sorts of special cases. So this is the first point that we have to consider when trying to examine contemporary politics through an evolutionary psychology lens.